The Enchanted House. It all began on the 12th of December, when Granny May was 82 years old. She never felt that she was 82. Her body might have looked it at times, but in her heart and her thoughts she still felt so young. It was in that year that she also found out that if you believe in something enough, you're halfway there to achieving it. Granny May had a splendid doll's house that she acquired for her grandchildren some years ago from an old man who was selling off his collection of toys when he retired from his toy shop down the road. This doll's house resembled a fine Georgian house, with a double-fronted opening so that you could see inside and admire all the little rooms in one go. The grandchildren really admired the brick effect facade at the front of the house, with the impressive classical style of windows, with 6 panes of glass sitting on top of another 6, and each pane being separated by a bar known as a Georgian bar. Granny May always liked to tell her grandchildren that this style originated from about 1730 to 1830, many, many decades before even she was around. This proud possession used to sit on top of Granny May's dark oak sideboard, and every time the children arrived, she carefully got it down for them to play with. When she acquired the house, it had very little furniture in it, but over the months she gradually collected or made pieces with her grandchildren to add to the charm of the beautiful house. Little Peter loved the bathroom with its own tiny bath and toilet that looked so like the real thing, and it was carefully tiled in little ornamental tiles, so miniature yet so lifelike. Rosie May, named after her grandmother, adored the little kitchen with its old-fashioned stove and little chairs that went round the table covered in tiny red check material cushions. All the grandchildren had gradually made items of food out of clay and plasticine that adorned the table and the scaled-down kitchen dresser. Alice loved the sitting room with its delightful little sofa and chairs, all made out of a floral print material. A pretend fire was secured to the back wall, making it hard to believe that it was not real. Peter even made little tiny logs to sit beside it. The rich green front door of the house welcomed any child to come and play with it, and every Christmas they made a miniature wreath to hang proudly on the door. Granny May even placed cotton wool round it every year to simulate the cold, snowy Georgian nights. All they needed now were carol singers. Which reminds me to get on with the story. Granny May, Peter, Rosie May, and Alice all felt that the only thing missing from this delightful house were the inhabitants. But suddenly Granny May remembered the little box she hoped that she still had safely in her attic. She retrieved the dust-covered case and carefully opened it, hoping to find what she thought was in it, all in one piece. Yes, they were, a whole collection of tiny animals resembling more of a human pose, standing up on their 2 legs. There was Mr. Badger, who looked himself big against the 2 baby badgers. Mrs. Bear wore a lovely little floral print dress and a tiny pinny tied round her waist. 2 grey rabbits, wearing no clothes and really looking like they really needed to be played with, were lying in a tiny knitted blanket. When all these were lifted out, Granny May realized there were 2 more, underneath another cloth cover. These 2 were Mr. and Mrs. Duck, he in a smart tailored suit, and she in a floral dress, easily comparable to that of Mrs. Bear. So all these wonderful little creatures were taken down from the dark, dusty loft and lovingly placed inside the doll's house, awaiting the next arrival of the grandchildren. It was as though they had all been reborn. Grandpa Joe thought they were all getting a bit too attached to this house. Surely there must be more important things to be doing." "Of course not," replied Granny May. "What can be better than feeding the imagination of our dear grandchildren?" Whilst Granny May was making hot chocolate in the kitchen for her visitors when they arrived next, she could hear the squeals of delight when Peter, Rosie May, and Alice opened the treasured house. They so loved the new inhabitants. "It all looks so real in here. I can't believe that they're not alive and going to come out and play with us," exclaimed Alice. The excitement almost made them forget their steaming hot chocolate waiting for them in the kitchen. This day was a memorable day, 12th of December, because of what happened later in the day when Granny May was safely tucked up with Grandpa Joe in their big bed upstairs, and Peter, Rosie May, and Alice had gone home and were also snuggled in their cozy beds. The front of the house slowly opened, just dislodging some of the cotton wool that had been placed around it to give the winter effect. Out came Mr. Badger, with the 2 baby badgers trotting behind him. Minutes later, Mrs. Bear appeared, closely followed by Mr. and Mrs. Duck. Not wanting to be left behind, the 2 rabbits were not far behind. They jumped from the sideboard to the bookshelf, onto the stool, and then onto the carpet. The woolen pile of the carpet seemed so thick and soft to their feet, so much so that the 2 baby badgers found it quite hard to remain upright. They could still feel the warmth of the fire that was smouldering in the grate. The size of it seemed quite alarming to the tiny animals. But gradually they became more adventurous. Mrs. Bear found Granny May's knitting and pulled some of it out, wondering what she could make with it. The 2 grey rabbits thought it fun to jump on and off the books lying on the floor, especially when they discovered sliding down the magazine of Grandpa Joe's that was propped up next to the books. Mr. and Mrs. Duck couldn't help admiring the beautiful flowers on the shelf, and wondered what happened with that red pillar next to it, with some cord through the middle of it. The end of this cord was slightly blackened, as though it had burnt like the fire they had just seen. They soon discovered that this was a candle, when Peter made a miniature one to go in their house, with a very lifelike tiny flame on the top of it. After a while the clock on the mantelpiece chimed. It made them jump at first, but Mr. Duck managed to count the 5 chimes. Slight daylight was beginning to appear, so the little animals thought it wise to head home before they were seen. They climbed back to the safety of their dwelling, and Mr. Badger managed to pull the front door back into place before returning to the dining room, where he had been placed by Alice when she left. That morning, Granny May put on her cozy red dressing gown and fluffy slippers and went downstairs to make some tea. Whilst the kettle was boiling, she couldn't stop herself having a little peek at the cherished doll's house. As she walked in, she noticed some cotton wool on the floor and thought there must have been quite a draught in the room to blow that down. Maybe Grandpa Joe had better check that the windows are not letting too much draught in, especially if we're going to have a cold winter, she thought. She placed the cotton wool back and finished making the tea. When Alice arrived after school, on her own, the others were doing something with their friends, she immediately went to the house to play with it. She called out to Granny May, "Have you been playing with the house today, Granny?" To which Granny May replied, "No, I've been too busy writing our Christmas cards today." Alice was most surprised. She was sure that she had left both rabbits tucked up in their beds, but one of them was standing beside his bed. Neither of them thought very much of this, and both enjoyed a peaceful end to the afternoon, playing with the house and drinking tea round the cozy log fire. That night, when the clock chimed 2, 8 little heads peered out of the windows of the Georgian house. Seeing that all was clear, the front of the house was pushed open, and the little animals continued their discovery of this giant room before their eyes. After jumping down onto the soft pile of the carpet, Little Rabbit jumped onto a black handset containing lots of symbols and numbers. What a surprise they got when the television flashed into life. The figures on the screen seemed so huge to these tiny creatures. Luckily, it wasn't too loud to wake up the sleeping inhabitants upstairs. Mr. Badger said, "We certainly don't have one of those magic gadgets to turn our television on." They had a very lifelike version of a television in their living room, but certainly not one with a remote control. Mr. Duck went up to the gadget and pecked the red button at the top, and immediately the invasion from the screen stopped. By now, the two little rabbits had found the hearth again, and were playing in the ash that had fallen into the grate. Mrs. Bear immediately pulled them out, tutting and brushing off the grey dust from their soft grey bodies. Mrs. Duck had found Granny May's knitting, and thought it so cosy to wrap herself in the green fabric that seemed to have grown out of a ball of wool. Time went on whilst the animals explored different parts of the room, so that they didn't realize how late, or early, it actually was getting. The Edwardian clock on the mantelpiece reminded them when the 5 chimes from inside it pierced the silence. Mr. Duck grabbed Mrs. Duck's wing and said, "You can't lie in all that wool any longer. We must get back." He dragged her out, and her cute little webbed feet got a bit tangled on the green wool. She soon freed herself, and all the little animals jumped back to the bookshelf, sideboard, and then into the safety of their home. As before, Mr. Badger eased the front of the house shut, and they were all safely in one piece back in their home. Granny May came down the next morning at about 7:30 to make a cup of tea for her husband and herself. She poked her head round the sitting-room door and realized that her knitting was sticking out of the basket. On pushing it back, she realized that 1 or 2 stitches had slipped off the needle. "I must have been very tired last night to have been so careless with my knitting. I must be more meticulous next time," she said to herself. She was just about to leave the room when she was aware of the light on at the bottom of the television. She called up to Joe, "You must be more careful. You left the television on standby." Joe thought to himself, "What's she going on about? I'm always very prudent about turning it all off." After school that afternoon, all 3 children turned up at the house, and, after a quick greeting and a rush snack, they raced into the sitting room to play with the house. Alice was the first to open the house, and instantly said, "I'm sure I left Little Rabbit in the kitchen last time. I put him by our homemade pizza, pretending he was having it for his tea." She picked him up to return him to the kitchen, when she saw he had specks of ash on him. "Granny and Grandpa, have you been playing with the house while we were gone? I think you must have dropped Little Rabbit out onto the hearth." Granny May and Grandpa Joe assured her that they had not, and not much more was thought about it. But that night, after the children had returned home, Granny May couldn't help thinking about the house, her wool being left awkwardly, and Grandpa Joe leaving the television on. She had to stop her mind racing on with all sorts of quirky ideas of what could be going on in that cherished little house. But then she thought, "May, you are 82 years old. Not a child. Pull yourself together." She tidied up, and then, just about to climb the stairs to bed, she stopped, and something made her return to the house. She carefully opened the front up and arranged all the little animals in a different and more unusual way. Mr. and Mrs. Duck were next to each other, facing the wall. The Badger family were tucked up in their wrong beds. Mrs. Bear was lying in the kitchen, and the 2 grey rabbits were placed top to tail in their bed. She closed the front of the house and left a small button right in front of the opening. Granny May laughed at herself for her fanciful thoughts, climbed up the stairs, and was asleep in no time. Once again, in the middle of the night, the family of animals made an appearance onto the sideboard, over the bookshelf, and down onto the lovely soft pile of the carpet. They explored and played for as long as they could, and then, as before, on the stroke of 5 o'clock, they scuttled back to their safety. Granny May couldn't get down quick enough in the morning, went into the sitting room and found her button on the floor in front of the sideboard. Mr. and Mrs. Duck were in the room they had been left in, but were facing each other, not the wall. The Badger family looked very cosy in their correct beds. Mrs. Bear was lying in a slightly different part of the kitchen, and the 2 grey rabbits were sleeping the other way round. Astonishing thoughts swept through Granny May's head. It was inconceivable that what she thought may be happening was actually happening. She kept these thoughts to herself, and later that night, after she knew Grandpa Joe was fast asleep, she tiptoed quietly down into the sitting room, completely covered herself with a warm, fluffy blanket, and lay in wait, as still as she could possibly remain. She found it exceedingly hard to stay awake, but on the stroke of 2 o'clock, she was aware of the front of the doll's house moving. First she could see Mr. Badger, with his black and white snout peering round the front of the house, closely followed by the 2 baby badgers. The speed at which they jumped down from the sideboard made Granny May want to gasp, but she kept as quiet as possible, as if her very life depended on it. They were then pursued by Mrs. Bear, the 2 grey rabbits, and then Mr. and Mrs. Duck. Granny May found it almost impossible not to laugh when the 2 grey rabbits, arm in arm, almost fell on top of each other as they landed in the thick pile carpet. It was so very comical to see Mr. and Mrs. Duck climb into Grandpa Joe's slipper and sit in it as though it were a boat. Mr. Badger tried to look into the giant newspaper that lay on the floor. For a while the 2 mini badgers couldn't find him underneath the sheets of paper. And so the revelry went on, and Granny May looked on with incredulity under her secret hideaway, making sure she didn't move a bone. As time went on, Mrs. Bear was looking towards the window, checking for the lightening sky. With very little ado, the little creatures all skipped and bounded back across the furniture into the safety of their little home. Granny May could hardly believe what she had witnessed, but she knew it was true, as the ducks had forgotten to place Grandpa Joe's slipper back neatly with the other one, something her husband always did. And of course, the newspaper was not exactly how it had been left. Without a moment's hesitation, Granny May raced up the stairs. Well, as much as an 82-year-old granny can race up the stairs. She rushed into their bedroom to tell her husband about the escapades she had just witnessed. Grandpa Joe, rubbing his sleep-laden eyes, looked at his wife, seriously thinking she was unhinged and clearly of unsound mind. "I think your preoccupation with our grandchildren's games have seriously got a bit out of hand. You're getting old, and you don't want to become a cranky old lady that everyone will choose to avoid." Granny May felt decidedly dispirited by her husband's reaction. She knew he took life a bit more seriously, but this was the limit, assuming she had simply become deranged. "Well, let me prove it to you," she exclaimed. "You wait overnight in the living room and see for yourself." At first Grandpa Joe thought this was a preposterous idea, but as the day went on, and as his wife also repeatedly went on, he decided that this was the only thing he could do. So that night he settled down on the same sofa, wrapped in the very same blanket, and lay in wait, whilst Granny May was safely tucked up in bed. It wasn't long before he started getting restless and fidgety. His left leg really needed to move, so he gave it a little wiggle. Then his nose began to itch. He really must trim his beard a bit. So he reached out from the blanket and gave it a quick scratch. Then his back itched, so he squirmed against the cushion which he was leaning on. Try as he might, he couldn't prevent his sneeze. No amount of nose wiggling could stop it. Finally, after all these minor irritations, he swept off the sofa and up to their bedroom. "It's no good. Nothing's happening. I'm simply down there getting cold, uncomfortable, and decidedly frustrated." He climbed into bed and was fast asleep before Granny May could even begin to complain. The next morning, over breakfast, Grandpa Joe could not resist carping and grumbling about his wife's eccentric behavior and outlandish ideas about this wretched doll's house. Similarly, Granny May could also not let it drop, so determined to prove that she wasn't deranged. But equally, she didn't relish further nights lying as quiet as a mouse on their sofa, which really didn't match up to their bed on a comfort scale. So she decided to set some traps to make sure she could prove what was going on in her dear little house. One night she placed a strand of red wool at the front of the house that would get knocked off as it was pushed open. That morning the wool was found on the floor. She then placed a small piece of paper just on the sideboard where they jumped down onto the carpet. This too was found on the floor the next morning. And so it continued for a whole week, when all sorts of little decoys were placed in the doll's house and all around the room to see if they moved. And every morning there was evidence of activity from all those dear little creatures. On the final day, to prove her discovery, she made some tiny pieces of miniature food and laid it just outside their house, only to find it all devoured the next morning. How she savoured all these daily reminders of what was going on in their tiny little world on the sideboard. That last morning she even found all the animals lying on their beds, definitely where they had not been left the night before. The nocturnal picnic must have tired them out. She presented all these findings to her family the next day. Peter, Rosie May, and Alice listened with eyes getting wider and wider, excitement and belief written all over their faces. Grandpa Joe just smiled and gave one of his looks, which said, "Have it your way, but I really don't believe you." He then got up and carried on mending his lawnmower outside in the yard. It was at that point that Granny May realized that if you believe in something enough, you are halfway there to achieving it, and that belief is worth living for and getting up for in the morning. She knew, Peter knew, Rosie May knew, and Alice knew, but Grandpa Joe couldn't comprehend such a thing, so he was nowhere near believing.